Picking up from our last episode, we now continue the journey of tracing the connections between Philonic and Gnostic thought using concrete examples. If you've not watched part 1 of this video, please do so. You can find the video link here. The next theme I'd like to discuss is luxurious Eden. Philo understood Eden to mean luxury, in Greek tryphe. The Alexandrians staunchly opposed luxurious practices and referred to pleasures as jailers. Nevertheless, Philo welcomed the delights of God's wisdom. He could link wisdom with luxury because he interpreted paradise, and specifically the tree of life, to mean wisdom, which was productive of virtue. Sethians, for their part, understood Eden to mean luxury as well, yet they consistently interpreted it, along with the tree of life itself, in a negative sense. To quote the secret book of John, the rulers took Adam and put him in paradise. They said, "Eat," meaning do so in a leisurely manner. But in fact, their pleasure is bitter. Their pleasure is a trap. This rewriting of the tradition is, in both cases, striking. For Philo, fallen humans wallow in luxury to strengthen vice, whereas the lower creators in the secret book of John design luxury to deaden the understanding of spiritually intelligent humanity. But for both, Eden means luxury, the luxury of sense perception, giving birth to pleasure. The next theme has to do with Adam's sleep. Philo called Adam's sleep, or rather his trance, ecstasis, the stillness and quietude of his mind. Elsewhere, Adam's trance signified the mind's withdrawal from the senses. In one case, it's good for the mind to withdraw from the senses, for in doing so it can behold noetic realities. Yet Philo also presented Adam's sleeping mind as something negative. The mind falls into a trance when it ceases to be engaged with noetic realities. When the mind sleeps, sense perception awakens. Sense perception can lead to the experience of pleasure, which can activate the passions. Those whose minds are controlled by passions are in danger of moral death, says Philo. And in this sense, the trance or ecstasis that God brings upon Adam in the garden is a negative change, a change which is even called the soul's destruction. The author of the secret book of John interpreted Adam's trance as a veiling of his noetic perception, literally an anesthesia, inflicted by the Creator. The supporting text is Isaiah 6:10. Quote, "I, God speaking, shall make their minds sluggish, that they neither understand nor discern." Now, in the nature of the rulers, Nag Hammadi Codex 2, Adam's trance represents ignorance, timentat saum. And in both cases, the trance is pejorative and destructive. Yet whereas Philo took pains to say that God kept the destroyer from laying waste the minds of his chosen, Sethians tended to highlight the Creator's hostility. The redeemed must awaken from the stupor inflicted not by vice, but by the Creator. This leads to our next theme, which is Eve as a means of knowledge. Philo famously symbolized Eve as a means of acquiring knowledge. She signifies sense perception, or aesthesis. The knowledge gained by sense perception, however, according to Philo, is inferior and dangerous. It is linked to the passions, which can in turn lead the mind, represented by Adam, astray. In Sethian portrayals of Eve, she also represented an epistemic faculty. Yet instead of being sense perception, she becomes, or is said to contain, a higher knowledge, enlightened insight, that awakens the sleeping mind of Adam. When enlightened insight appears in the form of Eve, Adam sobers up from his drunkenness and determines to leave his father, meaning the Creator, as well as his mother, meaning matter. In the nature of the rulers, the woman of spirit likewise comes to the sleeping, that is, ignorant Adam, and bids him to rise. And when he sees her, he calls her mother, physician, and says that you have given me life. Such interpretations stand in the tradition of psychological allegory that we have seen in Philo, but the meaning of the tradition is transformed. For Philo, Adam is on the level of spirit, the noetic level, and Eve is on the level of the lower soul, sense perception. The opposite situation occurs in the nature of the rulers. Eve is on the level of spirit, and she enlivens Adam, who was reduced to soul or animate nature. The interpretive goals are also different. Eve as lower knowledge brings Adam down to earthly matters, whereas Eve as higher knowledge raises him to spiritual life. In the background is a fundamentally different valuation of Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. For Philo, Eve led Adam into sin. For Sethians, Eve introduced Adam to true Gnosis. Then there is this controversial topic of forsaking womanhood. On several occasions, Philo uses the metaphor of forsaking womanly things, ta gunakea, meaning to forsake materiality and passions and to adhere to intelligible and divine reality. Philo's base text was Genesis 18:11, where the matriarch Sarah ceased female things in the Septuagint, here again ta gunakea. Philo allegorized the passions as female by nature, so that Sarah fittingly abandons these passions for more quote-unquote male traits of healthy emotions. Now, in terms of gender coding, Philo is actually unoriginal. He followed widespread cultural norms by symbolizing the female by what is material, passive, bodily, and sense perceptible, and the male by what is active, rational, unembodied, and more akin to nous. Yet Philo was distinctive in symbolizing moral and spiritual progress by a sex change from female to male. This tradition of escaping femininity crops up in Sethian texts as well. The Sethian hero Zostrianos, for instance, escapes from bodily darkness, animate chaos, and dark, lustful femininity, timent sahima and an epithumia. All of this happens before his ascent to heaven and final admonition: do not entrust yourselves to things inferior to you as if to superior things. Flee the madness and the fetter of femininity, timent sahima, and choose for yourselves the salvation of masculinity. Pi'u jayi entitiment haut. As in Philo, femininity represents inferior passions and matter, whereas masculinity symbolizes spirit, stability, imperishability. To become noetic or spiritual is coded as becoming male. It's a way of sharing in the reality of transcendent entities, including aeons and angels who are male in this system and even triple male. For both Sethians and Philo, the gender imagery is symbolic. They metaphorized salvation as masculine and even masculinized female heroes such as Eve, Hannah, Sarah, and Mary. In doing so, they inevitably reflect patriarchal values and reinforce male-dominant gender norms. And so we come to the serpent. Around 400 BCE, the mythographer Herodotus of Heraclea represented the serpent in the Garden of the Hesperides as the variegated reasoning of bitter desire. And in Philonic allegory, the Edenic serpent becomes a symbol both of desire and pleasure, hedony. A similar tradition was developed in Sethian sources, only one more specific about the type of pleasure involved. In the Secret Book of John, the serpent teaches about sexual desire, spora and epithumia, literally seed of desire, or the vice of sexual desire, ukakia and spora and epithumia. For Philo, the desire and pleasure that the serpent represents is more general, although he believes that sexual pleasures were the most extreme and hazardous. In his exposition of Genesis, he also notes that Adam and Eve's desire for unity gave rise to bodily pleasure, which is the starting point of wicked and criminal deeds, as he puts it. Such deeds, in turn, result in the loss of blessed immortality. Both Philo and Sethian authors agreed that pleasure could kill the soul. Interestingly, although for Philo the snake represents pleasure, when it's seized and tamed, it becomes instruction, paideia. In a Sethian retelling of Genesis, the serpent is called the instructor, pireftama, but only when inhabited by the female spiritual principle. On the topic of the garments of skin, you'll recall that these garments are given to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:21 after their fall. Philo is one of the first documented interpreters to understand these garments as a symbol of human flesh. Prior to their fall, in other words, the first humans were beings of spirit and of soul. They only gained their fleshly suits as a result of falling. Now, Sethians modified this picture. They never saw the human fall as willed by the first couple. Humans endowed with the spirit power of wisdom were rather pushed into flesh by hostile archons as a way to control humans and to hinder their spiritual element. Valentinians, in particular, continued the Philonic tradition of understanding the human garment, the garments of skin as human flesh. In fact, the identification of the garments as flesh is attributed to Valentinus himself by the Refutator. Valentinus, you'll remember, is only a generation after Philo's death. In Genesis, it is specifically the Creator, called Yahweh Elohim in Hebrew, who gives Adam and Eve the garments. And whether this Creator is viewed as hostile by the Sethians or neutral by the Valentinians, it was his idea to house the human higher self into a solid platform doomed to die and break apart. We now come to the family of Seth. For Philo, spiritual identity could be expressed in ethnic terms. In antiquity, the idea of family, or genos, which could be translated class, sometimes you'll see it as race, this was a fluid category and wasn't determined solely by physical characteristics. Shared virtue, knowledge, and ritual could alter one's genos, even if the term still functioned rhetorically as a marker of natural identity. For Philo, the family of Seth was important because it continued the line of righteous Abel. Abel, who is allegorized as a God-loving principle. Anyone whose nobility is determined by the love of virtue could name Seth as their ancestor, said Philo. Seth represents the seed of divinely implanted virtue. And the children of Seth are the people with virtue, that is, those who control their passions. They will always exist on the earth, says Philo, though in small numbers. And in time, their fate will be that of the patriarch Enoch. God will transfer them from a corruptible to a deathless family, meaning the family of the angels, so that they will not be found among earthly peoples. Now, as is well known, the Sethians look back to Seth as their spiritual ancestor. They considered themselves to be the kingless generation, an immovable because immortal minority living among the more populous peoples of Ham and Cain. In times of disaster, they believed, divine providence shielded their ancestors by transferring them to a safe haven. During the time of the Great Flood, for instance, Noah and other members of the immovable race were placed in a bright cloud. When the Creator later attacked the city of Sodom, great clouds of light descended upon the Sethians. They were rescued by angels and taken above the powers of darkness to live like angels on high, a distinctly Enochic destiny. Heresy writers spurned Sethian and Valentinian Christians for their supposedly genetic determinism. Nevertheless, Sethians could think of genos, that is, family and race, as family and filiation in the same metaphorical way that Philo did. And given Sethian suspicions about sex, they weren't saying that one needs to be biologically related to Seth. The children of Seth were rather those who proved themselves by a certain knowledge and virtue. Logically, then, the Sethian family could be expanded by people performing the same moral and ritual activities as Seth, their spiritual ancestor. Both Philo and the Valentinians saw the ancient patriarchs as symbols of certain kinds of life. Seth was the model of virtue, Abel the model of justice, Cain the model of injustice and human pride. For Valentinians, the threefold typology was simpler. Cain was the father of earthly people, Abel the father of animate people, and Seth the father of spiritual people. Philo's presentation was admittedly not so streamlined, but he did often divide the human race into three types of people. Among those making progress, there were people who train, represented by Jacob, people who are self-taught, represented by Isaac, and people who receive instruction by learning and education, represented by Abraham. If we include all of humanity, Philo says that there are earthly people tricked by sense perception into believing false realities. Then there are people who are making progress, swimming in the grand ocean of life, trying to lift their heads above the stream of sensations. Finally, there are sages who have claimed full control over their bodily impulses and desires. Jacob, or Israel, is a model of those making progress. Philo thought that the spiritual meaning of Israel was one who sees, and specifically one who sees God. This etymology is based on a possible reading of the Hebrew name. For Philo, God is the summation of spiritual and intellectual reality. Thus, the one who sees God is the one endowed with a higher form of perception, a spiritual perception and intellect that goes beyond the things of sense. So seeing is really a form of contemplation, the deepest level of understanding or of mystical insight. And the Valentinians continued this Philonic tradition of understanding Israel as the spiritual human being, the one not literally a son of Abraham, but the one who sees God, and thus a legitimate son of the faithful and spiritual Abraham, the one born of the free woman, not the person according to flesh, born from the slave woman. The final topic we'll discuss is exegetical inversion. What this means is that if a passage of Scripture did not confirm one's spiritual and moral preconceptions, its meaning could be transformed. And in some cases, the meaning could be remade to such an extent that it contradicted the apparent meaning accepted by other readers as the plain meaning. Now, I've called this exegetical inversion, that is, flipping the meaning of the text, and Philo was a master at it. In Genesis 38, for instance, the patriarch Judah has sex with his daughter-in-law Tamar, which was an incestuous act by Mosaic standards, because he rented her body with a pledge. Now, Philo was not willing to let so great a moral fault besmirch the reputation of the patriarch, so he reinvented Judah as a man who made a pledge not for incestuous sex, but for piety. This interpretive move was more than innocent allegorizing, since there's nothing in the text of Genesis 38 which would suggest that Judah was pious in his actions. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that Philo deliberately modified the meaning of the text in order to protect the character of the patriarch. Philo also reformed the lives of other biblical characters. He presented Tamar as stainless and worthy of good report. The priests Nadab and Abihu were devoured by fire for sacrificing incorrectly, according to Leviticus 10, yet Philo made them into holy principles, taken up by an undying splendor, as he says, since in sincerity they cast aside sloth and delay and consecrated their serious intent to piety. Now, these are deliberate and fairly radical transformations of the text. Where biblical heroes appear morally ambiguous or tainted, Philo consistently makes them models of unquestionable good. And this point is especially true when it comes to the Jewish deity. Philo spent enormous energy, intellectual energy, defending the Pentateuchal God from charges of ignorance, inchangeability, and jealousy. Sethian Christians, as it turns out, rewrote these very texts with the opposite aim, to make the Creator seem unambiguously bad. They portrayed him as a lion-faced serpent who unwittingly breathed divine spirit into Adam. He consistently tried to steal back this spirit, and to do so, the Creator was prepared to stupefy Adam, rape Eve, and drown humanity in a flood. At the same time, it would be misleading to suppose that Philo was the one who proved faithful to the meaning of biblical texts, while Sethian Christians perverted it. Sethians, although they did not share Philo's apologetic strategies, were like him attempting to solve perceived problems in the text. They were constrained by biblical texts, even if their rewriting practice might seem more aggressive than Philo's own. It's safe to say that both Sethians and Philo developed assertive intellectual stances that allowed them to adapt the meanings of biblical texts for their own intellectual ends. It's time to conclude. This discussion, actually, of exegetical inversion indicates that despite the continuity in the use of exegetical traditions, Philo and Sethians, and we might add Valentinians, were, attitudinally speaking, worlds apart. Philo's imaginative adventures into Scripture attempted to inspire piety, which he considered to be the queen of the virtues. Sethians, on the other hand, fostered a transgressive orientation. Philo strove to be the good son, the obedient follower of divine law. Sethians proved their divine sonship by rejecting laws of the lower creator, ascending past angels and archangels to aeons on high. What was it that intervened between Philo and the Sethians to help generate this altered attitude? Is still a matter of debate. Scholars plausibly surmise that Jewish uprisings that occurred between 66 and 135 of the Common Era had an acute effect on the attitude toward Judaism and the Jewish deity. Widespread anti-Jewish sentiment grew during this time, in particular among Egyptians, who had a history of polemically retelling the stories of Jewish scripture. Perhaps the most obvious intervening development, however, was the rise of Christianity. During the late 1st and early 2nd century, Christians were busily appropriating the meaning of Jewish scriptures while selectively distancing themselves from actual Jews in order to escape the stigma of seditiousness, as well as the Jewish tax called the Fiscus Judaicus. Some Christians, such as the author of the Epistle of Barnabas, who is probably Alexandrian, began to express an animus against practicing Jewish customs, and this animus was, in some cases, re-expressed as an animus against Jewish law, and also in some cases, the ultimate author of that law, the Jewish deity. This animus might have motivated some ancient Christians to find and to accentuate passages wherein the biblical creator failed to measure up to what was considered to be divine, all good status. The creator's statements, actions, and character proved not only that he was not good, but positively evil, that is, jealous, hostile, angry, in contrast to the God revealed in Jesus. Now, Philo probably died just as distinctively Christian interpretations were beginning in Alexandria. Nevertheless, for understanding these developments, his work provides an important key. Probably better than any other thinker, Philo shows how a first-century Jewish intellectual was attuned to the problems raised by Scripture, problems that persisted long after his time. Questions like, why did the Jewish deity appear jealous? Why did he forbid the fruit of Gnosis to the first humans? Why did he apparently change his mind about creating humanity? All these were questions percolating already in Philo's day. He did his best to answer these problems during his lifetime, yet his answers apparently proved unsatisfying to a new generation of Christian intellectuals with different prejudgments about the validity of Judaism, its laws, and its scriptures. In short, the problems raised by Philo show that it was possible for later Christians to conclude from biblical stories themselves that the Jewish creator was not good and thus not the true God. Naturally, Philo would have opposed any use of his ideas that supported a negative evaluation of the creator or of the religion of Moses, but Philo, like all others, had no control over the afterlife of his works. The scattered seeds of his thought were in many cases transformed into new and hybrid species of plants. History has always proved unpredictable, and the great Alexandrian could not have foreseen that his school of thought would become a seedbed for Gnostic Christian speculation. And if I myself were to speculate, I would say that the very first inheritors of Philo's works seem to have been not Christians later determined orthodox, but Christian Gnostics like Valentinus and Sethians, who guaranteed that the library survived, was reinscribed and passed on, so that it eventually made its way into Christian libraries of the 4th century.